The first time Daniel saw it, he thought the cold was playing tricks on his eyes. Through the swirling snow, a massive brown bear lumbered toward his cabin, its fur dusted white, breath steaming in the frigid air. But it wasn't threatening. Clamped in its jaws was a log, thick and dry, which it carried up the steps and set carefully beside a neat stack by the door. Without a sound, it turned and vanished back into the trees. The wind in Pine Hollow had a way of making a man feel smaller than he already was. It slid through the trees with a low, endless moan, curling under the cabin's eaves and finding every gap in the old boards. Daniel McCrae had grown up here, in winters that seemed longer and sharper than anything the lowlands could remember. Back then, the cold wasn't a thing to fight, it was simply a fact you lived with. Now, years later, he was back, not as a ranger on patrol or a young man chasing the line of the ridge with snowshoes strapped tight, but as someone seeking quiet. Retirement had driven him from the noise of the town to this single-room cabin his father once used as a hunting base. The roof had sagged a little, the stovepipe was rusted, but the bones were good. Daniel had spent the autumn fixing what he could, sealing the worst of the cracks, and hauling in his own load of firewood. By the time the first snow came, he thought he was ready. That night, the wind rose. The kind of wind that carries flakes sideways, building drifts against doors and burying trails before morning. Daniel lay under 3 blankets, listening to it, feeling the heat from the stove begin to fade. He told himself he had enough would stack to last, but the storm stretched into the next day, and then another. When the sun finally returned, the snow in the clearing was knee-deep, unbroken but for the dark cut of the tree-line. Daniel spent the afternoon shoveling a path to the shed and checking the pile, lower than he liked. He made a note to pace himself until he could split more. The next morning, he opened the cabin door to a sight that stopped him in place. Beside his own rough stack of logs sat a fresh pile, maybe 8, maybe 10 pieces, all neatly arranged. They weren't from his cut, these had been stripped clean of bark, ends squared, dry and ready. He glanced toward the woods, half expecting to see the trail of a snowmobile or the narrow depressions of snowshoes. But the snow beyond the porch steps was disturbed in only one way, 2 deep, heavy tracks that led straight to the tree-line. Bear tracks. Daniel's first thought was that some scavenger had been curious about the cabin and dragged the logs from somewhere else. But the pattern was too deliberate, no scratch marks, no clawed ends. Whoever, or whatever, had done this had placed the wood, not dropped it. The old stories came to him then, ones he'd half forgotten. Locals talking about a winter helper, some wild thing that left food or fuel for cabins along the upper ridge. Mostly shrugged off as talk from lonely trappers or too much whiskey in a storm. Still, the image of those fresh tracks lingered all day. By evening, he'd convinced himself it must have been the wind playing tricks, that he'd cut more wood than he remembered, and somehow the snow had revealed it in a way that seemed intentional. But 2 days later, it happened again. More wood. Same neat stack. Same heavy prints in the snow. This time, he followed them. They led in a slow, straight line toward the stand of pines east of the cabin, where the snow grew shadow-dark even at midday. The prints ended at a tangle of wind-fallen trunks and dense underbrush. Beyond that, the forest was quiet. He stood there a long moment, the cold biting through his gloves, before turning back. That night, as the fire cracked and the wind shifted against the roof, Daniel thought about the tracks, the weight of them in the snow. Bears should have been deep in their dens by now. Unless. The third delivery came at dawn. He woke to the sound, not loud, just a faint thump, followed by a creak on the porch. Pulling on his coat and boots, he eased open the door. And there it was. A massive brown bear stood at the edge of the porch, snow clinging to the fur along its back and shoulders. In its jaws, it held a thick log. It stepped forward, set the log carefully atop the stack, then turned without a sound. Daniel didn't move. The bear descended the steps, its bulk swaying with each step, and vanished into the pines. The only sound left was the faint hiss of falling snow. Daniel didn't step outside until the bear was gone. Even then, he moved slow, like sudden motion might undo the reality of what he'd just seen. The log sat where the bear had left it, dry, clean-cut, its ends squared like something prepared by a human hand. He crouched, running a gloved palm over the smooth grain. No bite marks. No splintering. Whatever the bear was doing, it wasn't just dragging deadfall from the forest. He looked toward the tree line. The tracks were clear, pressed deep into the snow by weight, moving in a steady line away from the cabin. No detours. No signs of rummaging. This wasn't scavenging. This was delivery. Daniel went back inside, poured coffee, and stood by the frosted window watching the sun push up behind the pines. In all his years as a ranger, he'd seen bears do surprising things, break into sheds, fish from frozen streams, even open the latch on a chicken coop, but nothing like this. Bears didn't help people. They didn't plan beyond their next meal or safe shelter. And yet, this one had chosen his cabin, and chosen to bring something he needed. By mid-morning, the thought of it was all he could think about. So he decided to test it. He stacked the fresh logs to one side of the porch and left the space by the door empty. If the bear came again, maybe it would place the wood in the same spot, proving it wasn't random. The snow came heavy that afternoon, thick enough to blur the line between sky and ground. Daniel stayed inside, mending a torn sleeve and listening to the stove breathe. Just before dusk, the wind dropped, leaving a muffled stillness over the clearing. That's when he heard it, a soft, deliberate thud against the porch boards. Heart thumping harder than he liked to admit, Daniel moved to the door. The bear stood there again, steam rising from its coat in the cold. It held another log in its jaws, just as before, and set it down exactly where the others had been, square with the porch edge, ends facing outward. Then, with a slow turn of its head, it looked at him. Daniel froze. It wasn't the wide-eyed stare of an animal caught off guard, it was measured, steady. A look that held for 3 long seconds before the bear turned and descended the steps. This time, Daniel stepped out onto the porch, gripping the rail with one hand as he watched it go. The bear didn't rush, didn't look back. It padded into the dark of the pines, snow closing around its shape until it was gone. That night, Daniel lay in bed with the fire banked low, thinking about that look. There had been no fear in it, no aggression. It was something else entirely, something almost like recognition. The next morning, he decided to follow the tracks farther than before. Bundling into his thickest coat and strapping on snowshoes, he set out early, hoping the trail hadn't drifted over completely. It wound through the meadow, across a frozen creek, and into the pines, where the snow lay quieter. The path curved around a rise, then dropped into a hollow where a ring of old cedar trees stood like a sheltering wall. Inside, the snow was trampled with broad paw prints. In the center lay a pile of logs, neatly arranged, more than Daniel could count in a glance. Some were old and half buried in frost, others fresh cut, their pale ends catching the dim winter light. He stood there a long while, boots creaking in the snow. This wasn't a random stash. The bear had been collecting these. For how long? And why bring them to him now? As the wind picked up, Daniel turned back toward the cabin, the questions pressing harder than the cold. By the time he reached the clearing again, the sun was low, painting the snow in long, bruised shadows. He caught himself glancing toward the tree-line, half hoping for another glimpse of the great brown shape moving through the dusk. Daniel woke before dawn the next day, the cabin still wrapped in darkness, the air holding that deep cold that makes every joint stiff. He didn't light the stove right away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, boots half-laced, thinking about the cedar hollow. That pile of logs hadn't built itself overnight. The bear had been working at it, possibly for years, stockpiling wood in a place sheltered from the worst of the wind and snow. The question that gnawed at him now wasn't just why the bear was bringing logs to his porch, it was where it had learned to do it at all. Daniel decided he needed to watch. Not just glimpse the bear as it arrived, but see the whole path, see if it came from the cedar hollow every time, see if it stopped anywhere else along the way. He had the skills for it, years as a ranger had taught him how to move quietly, how to read a landscape without being seen. But tracking a bear in winter was different than following deer or elk. Bears were powerful, unpredictable, and even the calmest seeming could turn dangerous in a blink. Still, the mystery was too sharp to ignore. That morning, after he'd split a few more logs of his own, Daniel took a pair of old army surplus binoculars from the shelf and checked them over. The glass was still clear, the focus smooth. He packed a small satchel with jerky, a thermos of coffee, and a wool blanket, then pulled on his heaviest coat. By mid-afternoon, he was set up in a snowblind he'd built years ago, back when he still came up here to monitor wildlife. The blind was just a low mound of snow and brush tucked into the shadow of a leaning pine, but it gave him a clear view of the meadow and the porch. He settled in, pulling the blanket around his legs, and let the hours pass. The light was beginning to thin when movement caught his eye. Out of the pines, the bear emerged, broad-shouldered, head low, a single log clamped in its jaws. Its fur was dark with melted snow, shoulders rolling with each step. Daniel tracked it through the binoculars as it crossed the meadow. The bear's pace was steady, deliberate, not the quick, erratic movement of an animal under threat. It reached the porch, set the log in the exact spot as always, then paused. Instead of leaving, the bear turned its head toward the snowblind. Daniel's breath caught. He was downwind, hidden by distance and brush, but something in the way it scanned the tree-line made his skin tighten. He didn't move. After a long moment, the bear turned back toward the forest, but not toward the cedar hollow. This time, it angled west, moving along the slope in a direction Daniel hadn't considered. When it was far enough away, Daniel slipped from the blind and followed, keeping to the trees, moving slow to keep his snowshoes from crunching too loudly. The tracks led to an old logging road, long since overgrown and drifted with snow. The bear followed it uphill, its bulk swaying side to side, until it reached a collapsed structure, a cabin, smaller than his, its roof caved in under years of rot. Daniel hung back, half hidden behind a pine, watching as the bear nosed around the ruin. It pulled something from the drift, a length of wood, maybe part of an old beam, and began dragging it free. It took its time, stripping snow and debris away, then lifted it in its jaws and started back down the slope. Only when the bear disappeared into the trees did Daniel approach the ruin. The place smelled of old pine and wet earth. The walls were barely standing, the floor warped and half buried under snow. In the corner, under a drift, he saw what the bear had been pulling from, a pile of neatly stacked timbers, some split, some whole, all dry despite the years. Someone had cut this wood a long time ago. And for reasons Daniel couldn't yet name, the bear had claimed the job of carrying it piece by piece to his cabin. Daniel stayed by that collapsed cabin long after the bear had gone, his boots half buried in the drift, breath curling in the cold air. The smell of old pine from the stacked timbers stirred something he couldn't quite place, a faint, almost forgotten echo of another winter. He crouched, brushing snow away from one of the logs. The cut was clean, the kind you only got with a sharp axe in steady hands. Whoever had left these here had meant them to last. The thought settled heavy in his chest, this wasn't just any cabin. He stepped back, scanning the shape of the ruin. The outline was familiar, the way the single window had faced the west ridge, the slope of the roofline, even in its collapsed state. Memories began to slot together. This had been the Collins place, back when the ridge still had half a dozen cabins scattered across it. And he remembered the Collins boy, too, Sam. 10 years younger than Daniel, all elbows and 2 long arms, but quick with an axe and always up for trading a morning's work for a story about the ridge. Sam's family had been hit hard one winter when the snow came early. Daniel's father had brought over extra wood, splitting it right there on the Collins porch. Sam had watched every swing, every placement of the logs. Daniel felt a prickle in his neck. The image of that bear, carrying logs with the same careful placement, lined up beside the porch, it was too close. Too practiced. Could it be? Could a bear have learned something just from watching people work? He'd read about wildlife picking up habits, ravens learning to unzip tents, raccoons opening coolers, but this was different. This was purposeful. The wind shifted, and with it came the low groan of a branch deep in the pines. Daniel glanced toward the sound, half expecting to see the bear returning. But the forest stayed still. He tightened his coat and began following the bear's fresh tracks downhill. The path led straight back to the cedar hollow, where the pile of logs sat untouched. From there, it curved toward his own clearing. He could see how the bear's route changed, sometimes straight from the hollow, sometimes detouring to the old cabin to pick up more wood. By the time Daniel stepped onto his porch, the sky had begun to bruise with evening. He dropped into his chair, the kind that creaked if you leaned too far back, and let the silence of the ridge settle around him. The bear's habit wasn't random. That much he knew now. It was collecting and delivering with an order to it, and that order matched the way Daniel's father had taught him to stack wood all those years ago. The thought of that connection, a thread between his own boyhood winters and this creature, was strange and unsettling, but also steadying, somehow. That night, he pulled an old photo album from the shelf, flipping past pages of spring trout and summer patrols until he found a yellowed snapshot of the Collins cabin. In it, he and his father stood beside a fresh woodpile, the Collins boy leaning on the porch rail, grinning like he'd been part of something important. Daniel set the picture by the lamp and sat back, staring at it until the fire sank low. The bear had a reason. He just didn't know if it was memory, instinct, or something in between. The next morning, Daniel rose before the sky had fully paled, the cold sharp enough to sting his lungs. The photo of the Collins cabin still sat by the lamp, its edges curled with age, the faint image of that young boy, Sam, grinning at the woodpile. Daniel couldn't shake the thought that somehow, across decades and species, that moment had left an imprint. If the bear's habit was tied to memory, its own or something inherited, then maybe, just maybe, Daniel could find a way to bridge the gap. He'd spent years keeping distance from wild animals, following the ranger's code, observe, don't interfere. But this wasn't an ordinary bear encounter. It had already crossed that invisible line, walking right up to his porch, placing its cargo with deliberate care. So he decided to test another idea, not by chasing it through the snow, but by changing what waited for it. Daniel spent the morning splitting fresh wood, choosing pieces of similar size to the ones the bear brought. He stacked them neatly on one side of the porch, leaving the bear's usual spot open. Then, beside that empty space, he placed something new, an old steel-splitting maul, its head dulled and its handle worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't much, but it was something from his father's shed, something that had once been part of every winter's work. He didn't know if the bear would even notice. But if it did, maybe it would understand that he recognized the act, that it meant something more than just fuel for a stove. By midday, clouds had begun to press in from the west, heavy with the weight of more snow. Daniel settled into his chair by the window, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, and watched the tree lean. Hours passed, the sky dimming toward that gray-green hue that meant a storm was coming. Then, movement. The bear emerged, head low, shoulders swaying under its thick winter coat. A log clamped in its jaws, it padded across the meadow without hurry. Daniel stood just inside the doorway, careful not to block the view. The bear reached the porch, set the log down in the exact spot as before, and then its head shifted. It sniffed toward the maul, stepping once, twice, until its nose brushed the worn wooden handle. For a moment, it stayed there, breathing in. Then it did something Daniel hadn't expected. It sat back on its haunches. Just sat there, still as the snow around it, the handle of the maul between its paws. The moment stretched until Daniel's breath frosted the glass beside him. Slowly, he eased open the door. The bear didn't flinch, didn't turn. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. The bear lowered its head once, as if to sniff again, then rose. Without looking back, it descended the steps and vanished into the pines. Daniel stood in the open doorway long after it was gone, the cold biting into his cheeks, the maul still sitting where it had been, marked only by the faintest dusting of frost from the bear's breath. By nightfall, the wind had started its long, low moan across the ridge. Daniel banked the fire higher than usual, knowing from the feel of the air that the storm would last through morning. The sky outside had gone from slate gray to pitch black, the snow falling in thick, wet flakes that clung to the windows before melting into streaks. He checked the porch once before latching the door for the night. The maul was still there, sitting where he'd left it, a thin crust of frost on the steel head. The bear hadn't returned since that quiet exchange in the afternoon. That was fine. In weather like this, even a wild animal would hole up somewhere sheltered. The storm hammered the cabin for hours, drumming on the roof, rattling the stovepipe. Daniel lay in bed listening to it, feeling the old boards flex in the wind. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire had burned low, and he got up to feed it, the light from the coals painting the room in a dim, rust-colored glow. That's when he heard it, a dull thump against the porch boards. He froze, hands still on the woodpile by the stove. It came again, softer this time, followed by the faint creak of weight on the steps. No animal in its right mind should have been moving in this storm, not in the teeth of wind like this. Daniel pulled on his coat and eased the door open against the push of the wind. Snow swirled into the room, stinging his cheeks. The bear was there. Its fur was heavy with wet snow, its breath steaming in the air. A log sat in the spot it always placed them, but this time it had brought more, 2, 3 pieces stacked in a tidy line. The bear's sides rose and fell in slow, deep breaths, its head lowered as if the weight of the weather pressed on it too. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching in the fresh drift. The bear turned its head toward him, but didn't move away. In the wind and snow, they stood facing each other, man and animal, the storm rushing around them. "Why now?" Daniel asked, though his words vanished into the howl of the wind. The bear gave a slow blink, then turned and lumbered down the steps, disappearing into the storm's white curtain. Daniel watched until even the movement of its shadow vanished. When he finally stepped back inside, he realized something he hadn't noticed before. The logs the bear had brought were split differently from the others, sharper, cleaner cuts, like they'd been prepared in a hurry. As if it had known the storm was coming and wanted to be sure he had enough. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the ridge wrapped in a heavy, muffled stillness. Snow lay in deep, uneven drifts across the meadow, glittering in the pale light. Daniel stepped onto the porch, breath clouding in the cold, and looked out at the trail of deep impressions leading away into the trees. The bear's path was clear, each print sharp-edged in the new snow, heading toward the west slope. He didn't hesitate. Pulling on his snowshoes, Daniel strapped a small pack to his back, thermos, jerky, extra gloves, and took up his walking stick. He knew from the bear's pace the night before that it wouldn't be far. Bears didn't burn energy in storms unless they had a destination worth the cost. The prints wound through the pines, dipping into hollows where snow had settled deep, then climbing the low ridge where the wind had scoured the ground to a hard crust. Daniel kept to the shadows where he could, careful not to make more noise than the creak of snow beneath his own weight. About an hour in, the trail dropped into a ravine choked with spruce. Down here, the snow was shallower, the air still. He could see where the bear's massive paws had pressed through the drifts to bare earth in places. The trail curved around a boulder and then stopped. At first, he thought he'd lost it, but then he saw the gap, a dark slash between two slabs of stone, half hidden by a tangle of spruce boughs weighed down with snow. Daniel crouched, peering into the opening. A faint smell of damp earth and old pine drifted out, mixed with something warmer, animal. He eased closer, careful to keep the light at his back, and saw what could only be the bear's den. Inside, the floor was littered with dry needles and bark, arranged in a rough nest. Against one wall, he caught sight of something else, small pieces of split wood stacked in a neat, short row. Not firewood for the bear's use, of course, but stored as if ready to be carried. And then he saw movement. The bear was there, lying in the shadows, its massive head resting on its paws. It watched him with slow, steady eyes. Between them lay the quiet space of the den's threshold, a place where wild and human didn't quite overlap, but didn't repel each other either. Daniel didn't step inside. He only nodded once and whispered, "I see it now." The bear shifted slightly, enough for the light to catch the line of its muzzle. Then it closed its eyes, as if the conversation, if you could call it that, was over. Daniel turned back into the snow, leaving the tracks as they were, untouched except for his own. The image of that den, the little stack of wood within it, stayed with him the entire walk home. Daniel couldn't shake the image of that little stack of firewood inside the bear's den. It wasn't just the neatness, it was the intention. That wood wasn't gathered at random. It was placed there, ready for something. Whether the bear understood why humans valued fire, or whether it simply mirrored a pattern it had seen before, Daniel couldn't say. But he knew one thing, it was offering something in the only way it knew how. By the next morning, he'd made up his mind. If the bear could bring something to him, he could bring something to the bear. He took his time choosing the right gift. It couldn't be food that would break a boundary too sharply and change the nature of their exchange. It had to be something that meant, "I understand," without crossing into dependence. He settled on a length of cedar, freshly split that morning, the scent sharp and clean. Cedar burned hotter and longer than most of the pine and spruce on the ridge. If this bear's ritual had roots in the old ways of humans here, ways the Collins family might have lived, then cedar was as close to a handshake as Daniel could manage. He wrapped the piece in burlap, tying it with a strip of twine, and waited until midday when the light was steady and the snow firm enough to walk without sinking too deep. The trail to the den was easier now, his own prints still faintly visible alongside the bear's. He moved quietly, each step measured, until the dark mouth of the den came into view under the spruce boughs. The air smelled the same as before, damp earth, old pine, but this time the bear was nowhere in sight. Daniel crouched at the entrance, setting the cedar just inside, beside the small stack of wood. He didn't linger, didn't call out. He simply placed it there and backed away, leaving his own tracks in the snow as the only sign he'd been. On the way back, he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. Part of him hoped the bear would appear, would acknowledge the exchange in some unmistakable way. But the forest stayed still, the only sound the muted groan of trees shifting in the cold. That night, snow began to fall again, fine and dry, whispering against the roof. Daniel sat by the stove, thinking of the cedar in that den. It wasn't a trade. It wasn't charity. It was something simpler, a shared understanding between two beings who'd chosen, for reasons neither could fully explain, to carry something to each other's door. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the forest washed in a cold, brittle light. Daniel stepped onto the porch with his coffee, expecting the same quiet he always found after a storm. But the first thing he noticed was the tracks, deep, wide, leading from the tree line straight toward his cabin. They weren't from the night before. These were fresh, crisp around the edges, the kind that caught the low morning sun like silver. The bear had come early? Daniel set his mug on the rail and followed the prints to the edge of the porch. That's when he saw it. The usual log sat in its place, neatly aligned with the stack as always, but next to it was something different, a small length of cedar, its cut edges clean and sharp. He didn't need to pick it up to know it was the same cedar he'd left in the den. The burlap and twine were gone, the wood bare, carrying the faint scent of spruce needles from where it had rested. He crouched, running a gloved hand over the surface. The bear hadn't just accepted the offering, it had carried it back to him. Not burned it, not left it behind, but returned it. Daniel leaned back on his heels, unsure what the gesture meant. Was it refusal? A kind of thanks? Or something else entirely, an acknowledgement that they both understood the cedar was special, too valuable to sit unseen in the dark? He carried it inside and set it beside the stove, resting it on the hearth as if it belonged there. Throughout the day, he found himself glancing at it more than once, the golden wood catching the firelight. By late afternoon, movement in the meadow drew his eye. The bear was there, pacing slowly toward the porch. No log this time, no burden in its jaws, just its massive shape moving with steady purpose. Daniel stepped outside, the cold biting through his coat. The bear stopped at the bottom step and met his gaze. The silence between them was as heavy as the snow-laden trees around them. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back toward the forest, leaving deep tracks that glimmered in the fading light. Daniel didn't follow. He only stood there, the cedar safe inside, wondering if the exchange had shifted somehow, if the bear had just told him, in its own wordless way, "I see you too." Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. The deep drifts in the meadow began to sag and thin, the creek behind the cabin pushing dark, narrow channels through the ice. Daniel could smell the change in the air, a faint wetness, the scent of thawing earth. The nights were still cold enough to bite, but the mornings no longer carried that sharp edge that burned the lungs. Through it all, the bear kept coming. Not every day, but enough that Daniel knew the ritual wasn't breaking with the change of season. Each visit was the same, a log placed in the exact spot, quiet eyes meeting his before it returned to the trees. The cedar stayed on his hearth, untouched. Sometimes, in the late evenings when the fire burned low, Daniel would catch himself looking at it like an old letter he hadn't yet decided to open. It wasn't just wood anymore, it was part of the language between them. One morning, as the snow retreated from the edges of the porch, Daniel woke to a sound that wasn't the usual thump of a log being set down. It was lighter, almost careful, followed by the faint scrape of claws on wood. He stepped outside and found the bear standing not at the steps, but beside the cabin. In its jaws was not a log this time, but a bundle of thin, dry branches, each one snapped to a perfect length, tied together with a strip of old burlap. The sight stopped him cold. The way the bundle was bound reminded him of how his father used to stack kindling for the Collins family, something he hadn't seen in decades. The bear walked to the porch, set the bundle gently beside the cedar, and stepped back. Daniel's throat tightened. This wasn't just a habit. It wasn't even just a ritual. It was a memory. Not his alone, but shared, carried forward through some invisible thread that linked a boy, a family, and a ridge that had seen too many winters. He crouched, his knees creaking, and touched the bundle. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but steady. The bear stayed a moment longer, then turned toward the pines, its bulk moving through the wet snow like a shadow fading into the trees. Daniel knew it might be months before he saw it again, maybe not until the first rail snow returned. But the meaning was clear now. The bear wasn't bringing firewood because it thought he couldn't manage. It was bringing firewood because once, a long time ago, someone had done the same for someone it, or those before it, had watched and remembered. As the sun broke through the thinning clouds, Daniel took the cedar and the bundle of kindling and placed them together on the hearth. They would stay there, unburned, as long as he lived in the cabin. Not just as a reminder, but as a promise that some gestures, once given, never really fade.